it's timely for me to make this speech because I've now been at the Bar Standards Board for around 3 years, just over 3 years. They have been pretty demanding and eventful years, beginning with COVID. And one thing I have noticed during that time is that the Bar Standards Board is more often spoken about than spoken for. So this evening I am going to speak for the Bar Standards Board. I'm going to talk about the role that we play, how we play that role, and some of the conditions that need to be in place for us to be effective in playing that role. Let me start though by some of the things that are said about us. Depending on to whom you listen, we either do far too much to the neglect of core regulatory functions, or alternatively, we're too passive. We don't do enough to promote the public interest. A possible reaction to these criticisms would be to assume that, in fact, we must be steering broadly the right course. After all, regulators are never popular, and if we're criticised in equal measure for doing too much, and on the other hand for doing too little, maybe we're getting it pretty well right. That isn't, in fact, my view. Some of the criticisms of us are justified. We have always rightly attached primary importance to the fairness and integrity of our decisions, but we have not always been as prompt and responsive as we could and should be in transacting business. We can also be smarter in using intelligence to inform regulatory action, and more on the front foot in taking action. I'll return to what we're doing in both those respects later in the talk. But I do think it's time that the Bar Standards Board spoke up. That's partly because I'm very conscious of the dedication and hard work of all the people who work at the Bar Standards Board. Their efforts deserve a voice. And so too do their achievements, the consistently high standards of our decisions, the groundbreaking analysis and research we've published on equality at the bar, the reforms of bar training we have carried through, reduced costs, improved flexibility, maintained standards, the important work we've done to improve access through our transparency rules, the work we've done with third sector organisations to enable consumers, particularly consumers from vulnerable backgrounds and in vulnerable circumstances, to find their way through legal services. I could go on in recounting some of the achievements of the Bar Standards Board. More fundamentally, though, the criticisms that come our way often reflect differing views about what the role of a legal services regulator should be. Are we there to perform a narrow range of regulatory functions, or are we there in a more expansive sense to promote the public interest? So this evening I want primarily to address that question, to explain how we in the Bar Standards Board see our role and how our view shapes the approach we take to regulating in the public interest. And I want to make 5 arguments. The first is that the regulation of professional services is not the same as the regulation of economic utilities. There is scope for collaboration between the regulator and the regulated. And indeed, in the case of legal services, the professions have a long and honourable tradition of self-regulation, which has been an important safeguard of independence. The second, however, is that the public interest and the interests of the profession are not the same. The regulator is there to champion the public interest, and the public interest is not simply confined to acting as gatekeeper and disciplinarian on behalf of the profession. The third flows from the second. It is that the regulator must accordingly make independent judgments in delivering our functions about how effectively the profession is serving the public interest in terms of all the regulatory objectives established by the Legal Services Act 2007. This does mean that the regulator and the profession will often take a duplicate interest in many issues, but need not mean they duplicate activity where they share a common analysis of risk or opportunity. The fourth argument is that the Bar Standards Board must focus on how well the bar in particular is serving the public interest. The risks and opportunities at the bar will not necessarily match those of other legal professions. And fifth and finally, independence is essential to the Bar Standards Board's ability to do its job. Independence must be understood not just as independence of decision making, but also as operational independence and, importantly, psychological independence. So let me turn to the first of those arguments. Regulating a profession differs from regulating an economic utility. Why regulate a profession like the bar? The then government, in proposing the legislation that was enacted in the Legal Services Act 2007, was very clear, and I quote in its white paper, that the purpose of the changes is to put consumers first. In this, the government was echoing the earlier findings of David Clementi's review, which found that the pre-existing self-regulatory arrangements had, and I quote again, insufficient regard for the interests of consumers. Pause, though, on why the needs of consumers are in need of protection. Not, I think, because the consumer is at risk of economic exploitation by powerful monopolies. On the contrary, legal services in general, and the bar in particular, are marked by high levels of competition. Indeed, the bar is still a very fragmented profession. The great majority of barristers are self-employed. In that respect, the regulation of legal professions is different from the regulation of, say, economic utilities. The producer interest in the provision of utilities is, as Adam Smith recognised, focus on exploiting monopoly to maximise profit, and accordingly is opposed to the interest of the consumer in competition and good value. The economic regulator is there to redress the economic balance in favour of the consumer. It follows that relations between the regulator and the regulated should be correct, but never collaborative. The regulation of professions is not like that. The public interest does not lie in countering monopoly power, but in negotiating the inevitable information asymmetries and complexity inherent in a specialist field, which most of the public will only encounter on an intermittent basis. On the contrary, the public and professional interests overlap. Barristers share the public interest in the strength, diversity, and independence of their profession. This commitment is manifest at the bar in the time and energy many barristers give to the training and development of the next generation and to pro bono work. I see this quite frequently myself. I make a point of going to the training, the excellent training which the inns provide for pupils and for newly qualified barristers. I am always hugely impressed by the number of senior barristers and judges who are giving up time to the education of the next generation. It's also manifest in the excellent work which the Bar Council, the inns and the circuits do to promote good practice at the bar. It also reflects, of course, the fact that for much of their long history, the bar and the other legal professions have indeed regulated themselves. That tradition of self-regulation has been an important safeguard of the independence of the professions from pressure to toe the line of governments or causes. The independence of the legal professions is more important now than ever when governments chafe at the constraints imposed by niceties like the rule of law. The principle of self-regulation was carried forward in the Legal Services Act 2007, which required the representative bodies designated by the Act as approved regulators to establish their own independent regulatory arms and to delegate to them their regulatory responsibilities. So regulation became independent, but also continued to be anchored in the profession itself, not a creature of government or parliament. It follows, therefore, that I agree with the Legal Services Board conclusion in its recent report on Silex and Silex regulation that the professions and their regulatory bodies should work effectively together to secure shared objectives. We are not adversaries. That is not, however, the same thing as saying that there will always be an identity of interest between the profession and its representative body, the Bar Council, and the Bar Standards Board as regulator. Because although we do share objectives, we approach those objectives from different angles of vision. As the regulator, we approach the delivery of our regulatory functions in the public interest. The Bar Council is there to represent the professional interest. Sometimes the two will coincide, but not always. That this should be so is fairly obvious when we reflect on the nature of the public interest itself. It's helpfully defined in the first section of the 2007 Act. There you will find regulatory objectives which the profession would certainly endorse to the full. Adherence to the rule of law, the profession's own independence, diversity and strength, the maintenance of professional principles all fall into that category. But alongside these objectives are others which go to the reason for reforming legal services regulation in the first place: to protect and promote the interests of consumers, to improve access to justice, to improve public understanding of the citizens' legal rights and duties. All these are designed, as David Clementi recommended, to put the consumer first and to provide the consumer with a champion undaunted by the complexity and by the information asymmetry which give the profession the upper hand in its dealings with consumers. This has a big consequence for us as regulator in exercising the arrangements delegated to us. We are not there simply to act as gatekeeper or disciplinarian in individual cases, but to ask searching questions about how the wide range of arrangements and rules we oversee support or inhibit the bar in meeting those regulatory objectives and meeting the needs of the public. The bar as a profession is certainly not opposed to these public interest objectives, but nor, I suspect, are they at the forefront of its mind. Self-employed barristers, around 80% of the total, have limited personal interest in how well the bar as a profession is meeting the present and future consumer interest in competition, access, and good comparative information. On the contrary, the long traditions of the bar, in many ways a strength and safeguard of independence, also underwrite many unexamined practices which may have outlived their usefulness and no longer work in the interests of consumers or indeed in the interests of the diversity of the bar itself. For example, the future supply of barristers, and hence the public's access to their services at competitive prices, will be determined in the long run by the cumulative decisions being taken now by chambers and employers about how many pupils to take on, and in the case of chambers, how many tenancies to award. Does that accumulation of individual decisions, both globally and specialism by specialism, result in an answer which will ensure adequate supply in all specialisms for the long term? It may, but then again, it may not. We can see, in fact, that the profession is steadily aging. And when I was in government, I was always very surprised at the lack of a workforce strategy for the National Health Service. I don't want to find in 10 to 15 years' time that we should have had a workforce strategy for the bar. Or to take another example, we need to consider whether when solicitors refer clients to barristers, it's in the client's interest that they often provide little or no choice, and whether this may entrench inequalities in the distribution of work among barristers themselves. Or again, many barristers' chambers occupy premises little changed since the 18th century. I've visited several in the last few weeks, and I can tell you now, no disabled person would get through the front door. So what steps are being taken by the chambers and their landlords to ensure that these premises are fully accessible to disabled barristers, pupils and clients? And if they really cannot be made accessible, are they really any longer fit for purpose as modern office accommodation? These are proper questions for the regulator to ask in fulfilling our functions. A further consequence follows from our duty as the regulator to view our functions through the prism of the public interest. The Bar Standards Board cannot simply resign to the Bar Council an exclusive interest in the pursuit of some regulatory objectives. We must form our own judgment about the risks to all the regulatory objectives, and to the extent that those risks engage our functions, about the interventions needed to manage those risks in the public interest. And incidentally, when I talk about risks, I include here the risk that new opportunities, the opportunities offered by technology, for example, will not be exploited to further the interests of consumers. So there will, I'm afraid, be duplication of interest, analysis and reflection between the Bar Standards Board and the Bar Council. We cannot, for example, simply say that the diversity of the profession is a matter for the profession itself, and that we shall disinterest ourselves in whether the profession is a good reflection of the society we serve or serves all consumers equally. Duplication of interest should not, however, result in duplication of activity. In some cases, we as the regulator shall be able, and indeed eager, to collaborate with the Bar Council in reducing risk or seizing opportunity. A good example of that is the work we are doing now to support chambers in their oversight of standards, equality and access. The Bar Standards Board spells out in our equality and other rules the minimum requirements of practice management for barristers belonging to a set of chambers. Increasingly, we shall express these requirements in terms of outcomes rather than in terms of processes or policies. We are very conscious, however, that the Bar Council, the circuits and specialist bar associations have all published much useful guidance in meeting the outcomes we all want to see. Many chambers exemplify outstanding practice. So let's work together and make it easy for chambers, particularly smaller chambers, to find their way to guidance and good practice, which will help them to meet our regulatory expectations. This is a win-win. The more assurance the Bar Standards Board can take from the quality and robustness of chambers' governance, the less need for regulatory intervention. The Bar Standards Board and Bar Council should also be careful not to duplicate each other in requesting information from barristers and from chambers. Indeed, I've come to the conclusion that the Bar Standards Board should in future make only targeted information requests where warranted by our analysis of risk, and not repeat our 5-yearly omnium gatherum regulatory returns. I pause for a splattering of applause. There will be other areas where we can agree a division of labour in pursuit of shared objectives, always recognising that as the regulator we reserve the right to act ourselves through regulation or other means where that is necessary to the protection of the public interest. So you would be right to interpret what I have just said as an assertion of our determination to make judgments about the public interest independently of the profession, but not to rule out working with the profession. I am equally clear, however, that the Bar Standards Board must make independent judgments about the public interest as it applies to the bar and in the light of the circumstances of the bar. This will govern the extent to which we're able to adopt approaches in common with other legal services regulators. Opportunities for common action do exist. Since arriving at the Bar Standards Board, I have, for example, consistently championed a cross-cutting strategy for public legal education. Consumers really don't care about professional boundaries. They care about gaining access to good value professional help to identify and fix pressing legal problems. It makes perfectly good sense, therefore, for the legal services regulators to join forces to identify what are the most pressing legal needs, particularly for consumers in vulnerable circumstances, what information those consumers need to help them address their needs and to find the right professional help, and what are the best channels for delivering that information. And I build here on a great deal of experience of financial services, where I saw an attempt to achieve that through a single website run by the Many Money advice service, to the detriment of communication with consumers who relied very heavily on third sector organisations, which they trusted to a much greater extent. So the channels are actually very many and varied, and they will include the websites run by the regulators themselves, but will also embrace third sector organisations trusted by consumers and to which consumers turn for help. The point is that no one regulator can cover all the bases. We need to work together on common principles and to a shared analysis of need. Not all regulatory challenges are, however, like public legal education. The reality is that in many important respects, the bar is not the same as other legal professions. It is predominantly, although not exclusively, a referral profession. Its stock in trade is advocacy and advice. Barristers do not handle client money and do not execute deals on behalf of their clients. Much of the bar, though not all of it, is characterised by high levels of competition, which gives good assurance of continuing high professional standards. That in turn shapes the nature of the risks to the public interest we see at the bar. As I have already indicated, we do worry about the risk that referral arrangements represent to choice for consumers and to the fair distribution of work for barristers. We are concerned that many long-standing but unexamined practices in recruitment and the distribution of work run counter to equality and inclusion. I don't think that sifting out everybody except the Oxbridge firsts as a pupillage recruitment practice is a good one, for example. Many chambers are not accessible. We should like to see barristers receive more regular feedback on their performance from a range of sources, including the judiciary. We'd like to see chambers play a more prominent role in overseeing standards, equality, and access. But we see little evidence of a generalised problem of professional standards. We judge that the risks to the implementation of sanctions and to anti-money laundering regulation are lower at the bar than in some other legal professions. Indeed, if you told me that a sanctioned individual or organisation was seeking the advice of the commercial bar about their obligations, I would probably regard that as lowering the risk of a breach rather than accentuating it. So independence of judgment does not just mean independence of the profession. It also means independent judgments about the risks to the public interest at the bar. And that brings me to my fifth and final argument. I've placed much emphasis on the importance of independence, above all of independent judgments in the public interest and in the public interest. But that's all rhetoric. So how is rhetoric turned into reality? In fact, independent decision-making is a necessary but not sufficient condition for success. The Bar Standards Board must also have the operational freedom and capacity to support effective decision-making. We need both to deliver our regulatory functions efficiently and to be on the front foot in analysing risks to the regulatory objectives and in implementing appropriate responses to those risks. Our current programme of reform will deliver in both these respects. We aim to be operationally excellent in delivering the gatekeeping and disciplinary functions which matter to the public and to the profession day to day. We have always quite rightly set a high store by the fairness and integrity of our decision making. There can be no compromise on that, but quality must be matched by speed and responsiveness. So I was really pleased that the board at its last meeting approved a balanced scorecard, which will give in future a much better balanced view of our performance in handling key regulatory functions. So we shall need people with experience of delivering and simplifying complex processes and of customer care, and we shall need the kit to support them. We shall also need outstanding analysts and researchers who have cut their teeth in regulation and understand that regulation must be proportionate to risk and evidence-based. The Bar Standards Board must have the freedom to frame, pay and other HE policies which will enable us to attract and retain such people. We do not need to pay top dollar, but we do need to be competitive. And that is not all we need. We also need to have in place the values, policies and behaviours which support a strong, independent regulatory culture. Alongside operational freedom goes psychological self-confidence. The Bar Standards Board must see itself and be seen by its stakeholders as credible and independent. Our board models exactly that. The board has great diversity and depth of experience. Its members have always been very clear about the importance of independent judgment in the public interest. Viewed, however, from a distance, you can see that may not always be apparent when we continue to be an integral part of the General Council of the Bar, a single organisation with two faces, sharing services and occupying the same offices. So yes, the Bar Standards Board and the Bar Council must have a constructive relationship and work together effectively. We shall often be collaborators, not antagonists, though we may occasionally be the latter. But the relationship to work well must be one of equals, not a dependent relationship. Indeed, the very credibility of the Bar Standards Board, and hence its ability to regulate in the light of the specific and distinctive characteristics of the bar, rely on being and being seen as robustly independent. So there we are. That's the world according to the Bar Standards Board. It's not a world in which we are or should be free of criticism. On the contrary, we value transparency and accountability. And it's not a world in which we are perpetually at loggerheads with those we regulate. There is much scope for cooperation and the elimination of unnecessary duplication. But it is a world where the Bar Standards Board makes independent judgments about how to take forward our regulatory functions in the light of the public interest, and itself decides where our aims can best be fulfilled in partnership with the profession or with other regulators. It's a world in which we shall sometimes decide that we must act independently of both the profession and other regulators to address risks to the public interest at the bar or to seize opportunities. It's a world in which the Bar Standards Board must have operational and psychological independence as well as independence of decision making, because we cannot take strong independent decisions without the right people and without a culture built on confidence and credibility. So thank you very much. Yes.
First of all, having had the absolute privilege of working with some of your team, I completely support and endorse your observations at the beginning about how hard they work and the value and the fantastic work that they do.
Which sadly doesn't always attract as much attention as some of the legitimate criticism they got.
I think there's always, I think it's always very difficult for the regulator to distill down what they're doing from other aspects of what's going on. So you quite often see criticism of actually sort of perhaps, not necessarily the guns are not pointed in the right direction. But my question really related to, I think, the concession that you made at the beginning to do the delay, and it's certainly not unique to the BSB. I work across a number of different regulators and have done for years, and I suppose my particular interest in asking, because being referred to your regulator is always absolutely devastating, and you have then witnesses who, the longer things go on, the harder it is to keep them on board. I do a lot of cases around counter-inclusive behaviour, and delay is always your enemy in terms of abuse of process, in terms of keeping the witnesses on board, in terms of health, in terms of the respondents' health. So it's a really big problem. It's certainly not unique to the BSB, and regulation seems to be, every single year, this kind of ever-increasing sort of thing that doesn't seem to ever reduce, no matter how hard we try, other things like consensual disposal and upstream regulation. So I just wondered, is there cause to be sort of optimistic? I don't just mean with the BSB, and I'm not asking you to speak for the regulators, but is there cause for optimism about delay? And do you see a solution to it? Because sometimes when I look at it, and I look at some of the initiatives there have been, and yet it still seems to be such a difficulty.
Yeah.
And I really emphasise not a criticism, because I myself have an investigatory practice, and as well as being an advocate, so I know, sometimes how hard it is to get the right balance.
Yeah. Well, it's a big issue for us, because whether you're making a report on a barrister which goes to investigation, or you are the barrister under investigation, for the most part, you want the thing to be wrapped up as quickly as possible. Though a minority of barristers do exploit the process to the maximum, and that sometimes adds to delay.
Sure.
But there are ways forward. That's exactly why we have just commissioned an independent end-to-end review of our enforcement process to find more efficient ways of operating. It's why we are placing more emphasis on timeliness and responsiveness and customer care in all the work that we do, and why in future, as part of our balanced scorecard, we'll be looking at the time it does take us from the beginning of receiving a complaint to the end of an investigation, so that what we're measuring is what the barrister or the consumer who made the complaint actually experiences. Not a sort of a sterile KPI, and we will be working to drive down that time that it takes from us receiving a report to the conclusion of an investigation. With the one caveat that I will always make, that getting the decisions right and fair is by far the most important dimension of this. And if it takes a little extra time to be fair and robust in our decisions, then we should do that rather than sacrifice quality to speed.
Definitely agree with that.
Sam.
Mark, thank you very much for your speech. Sam Tanner, the Vice Chair of the Bar, and the Chair, as you know, Mark sends his apologies at the Judicial Diversity Forum today. Thank you for your speech, much of which we've discussed before, with the creative tension, if I could put it like that, between the BSB and the Bar Council, and we welcome most of it, I would have thought. One point I would just like to ask you about is the under your fifth argument.
Yeah.
I mean, from the Bar Council's perspective, when we see. By the way, can I also add on performance? We're cautiously optimistic that on complaints handling, the BSB has really turned the page, and as Mark says, we very much welcome the end-to-end investigation that's being done independently to see whether there's smoothing of the relation. So please don't take my point as being a criticism. We welcome the hard work of staff at the BSB in doing that. The truth of the matter is, though, when it comes down to funding, and this is the Gordian knot, I suppose, about the way in which it works under the 07 Act. The Bar Council is the approved regulator, delegating its regulatory functions and arrangements to the BSB. But we, the Bar Council, in fact, have no say on the budget other than being able to represent the position to you as the steward of the BSB, and then ultimately to the Legal Services Board. And so we certainly feel like there is complete operational and psychological independence. And that's reflected, for example, in the fact that the proportion of the practicing certificate fee that goes to the BSB has moved from 60% of the practicing certificate fee to 70% over quite a short period, less than a decade. So, I mean, it's perhaps more of a statement than a question, but certainly our perspective is that there is that very much that independence. We would, in some ways, like to have more of a say, but certainly on HR and all these other things, you know, as far as we can see, we have no take or control at all. So as far as we're concerned, that's job done. But I mean, I appreciate you might have a different perspective.
No, thanks, Sam. I mean, perhaps one thing I should say is that although you're obviously not there to witness it, our board, does debate very thoroughly the business plans and budgets that the executive presents to them, and is certainly very conscious of the costs flowing back to barristers through the practicing certificate fee of those costs. We did significantly increase our budget a couple of years ago, and that was mainly because we implemented, before my time, some quite major reforms in our organisation and in our way of handling the enforcement functions, and simply found that we had built too little resilience into the teams handling those functions to enable us to meet acceptable standards of timeliness, and the performance statistics are witness to that. But I do assure you that costs are absolutely debated in the board, and we will not allow them to run away with us. Yes.
Yeah, I do a lot of regulatory stuff. I do some stuff at BSB as well. But one thing that sort of strikes me in all the regulators I deal with is this question of what is the public interest and how on earth you determine that. Because I don't think when regulators say this is a public interest, they're giving primarily their own view without any really basis for the public, whoever they might be.
Yeah. Well, from our perspective, the public interest is defined by Section 1 of the Legal Services Act 2007, and in exercising our functions, we have to have regard to the public interest as set down in that section of the Act, and it's quite broad. I mean, broadly speaking, it embraces two sets of things. It embraces some things that are about the profession itself, the strength, the diversity of the profession, its adherence to professional principles, the support it provides to the rule of law, and on the other, it's about how the profession serves the consumer interest. So it's about the interests of consumers, it's about access to justice, it's about consumers' understanding of their legal rights and duties. My board, quite rightly challenged by our friends in the Legal Services Board, challenges us to demonstrate that, in the work that we do, we are faithful to those regulatory objectives. So I would say it's Parliament that has told us, how we should think about the public interest in carrying out our functions. Yes.
Hello.
Richard.
Richard Orpin, Director of Regulation and Policy at the Legal Services Board.
Very warm welcome, because you're in your 4th week.
I am, yes, just recently joined. Thank you. Thank you for the speech. I wondered if I could get your observations on something which I think is going to shine a light on the legal profession in the coming months and perhaps years, the Post Office Horizon inquiry, what that might reveal in terms of sort of underlying professional ethics and the culture, clearly at the bar, but beyond the bar as well. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about the Bar Standards Board's perspective on culture and professional ethics.
Well, it's a huge issue, because this is one of the most serious miscarriage of justice that we have seen, certainly in our lifetimes, and it goes, I think, particularly, though not exclusively, to the ethics of employed lawyers, both employed solicitors and employed barristers, and the priority which they must always give, and which our code of conduct is very clear about, the priority which they must always give to the rule of law and to the court. So it will be fascinating to see how the public inquiry currently sitting finds in relation to the lawyers involved and their adherence to that really very important principle. But from the perspective of the regulator, nothing could be clearer than that. Barristers' primary duty is to the rule of law and to the court.
If I may, I'd like to, David Guinera, I'm a practicing barrister and other things as well. Delighted to be here, and I really appreciate the commentary and presentation. Very, very interesting, and I think very timely. I'd like to build on 2 questions that were just asked, one on public interest, the other on effectively government interaction, which are, I think, also very timely right now. But I hope you'll humour me, because I want to extrapolate a couple of the points that I think you made in terms of my ultimate question. And I think the ultimate question is, are we actually helping the public? I think, a couple of things that come out of here: priority on interests of the consumer, priority on improving access to justice, the public interest. There was one comment, and I don't want to misquote it, but it was some comment to the effect of 80% of barristers or self-employed barristers aren't terribly interested in the operation of things.
It's not quite what I said.
I said it
probably wasn't in the forefront of their minds.
Maybe not in the forefront of their minds. That may actually indeed be accurate. But I think that a lot of barristers do care.
Yes, no, I'm sure they do.
Deeply, increasingly so. We look at things like the deluge of litigants in person and the expectation that they will navigate a court system which is clearly broke and broken. We ask them to digest the white book, which is about the size of a small building. Somehow we haven't been able to convey that through technology and something that the average person can use, let alone a lawyer. And we talk about helping vulnerable clients. My question is, when we talk about sort of the collaboration, working together and cooperation, whether it be between the Bar Council, the Bar Standards Board, the Legal Services Board, and God help us all, the government as well, and various other folks, how's it all coming together? And my question may be unfair if it's, that's not part of the Bar Standards Board remit. I'm not trying to, stab you with something that isn't yours, but if you step back as a member of the public, and I've talked to a lot of folks in the public side, they ask the question, how does it work? All they see is the occasional headline where finally barristers who do criminal work get a pay rise. Everybody says, oh, look, lawyers getting pay rise. But the reality of the situation is stark. And so my question really goes to what level of cooperation and collaboration is going on between all of the various regulatory bodies or what more could be done. And I apologise if that's not within your remit, but it's become such a hot topic. So if I go back to that comment about the 80% of barristers, I can guarantee that a high percentage of those same barristers do care deeply about access to justice and the civil justice and the criminal justice system. So anyway, there we go.
Well, it's not something that we can solve single-handedly as the regulator, but we do a good deal of work, and we're very sensitive to the issue of litigants in person. So we support through court, for example, as an organisation. My colleague Wilf is on their board, and we have channeled a good deal of our support for public legal education to third sector organisations who in various ways are trying to help litigants in person, but also other consumers in vulnerable circumstances navigate their way through legal services. So we support Law for Life, for example. But I agree with you, the problem is much bigger than the Bar Standards Board can solve. It's one of the reasons why I've argued that public legal education should be something on which the legal services regulators come together, but also on which we should make common cause with third sector organisations, because many of the people you're talking about are not going to find their way quickly to the Bar Standards Board website. They're much more likely to go to Citizens Advice or Law for Life or support through court, and it's important when they do, they find good, intelligible information there that will support them. So I hope that helps. It's what we can do, consistent with our objectives, but I fully concede it's not a full answer to the problem you've described. I don't know, Wilf, do you want to say anything?
No, I think that's right. It's very much an issue that is a priority for the Bar Standards Board. We've done a lot of work on public legal education in recent years. And the other organisation that we work closely with, who Mark didn't mention, was Advocate, the Bar's pro bono organisation, who do a lot of fantastically good work, as you know. But I think the problem for all these organisations is that demand far outstrips supply at the moment, and there's a limit to what we can do and a limit to what they can do. And access to justice is, I think, a real issue for thousands of people in this country. I know it's something that our friends in the SRA have also spent a lot of time concerned about. And there was a very interesting piece of research published recently by LexisNexis looking at what they call legal aid deserts. And it's horrifying to see vast areas of the country where there are simply no legal aid solicitors at all. But there's a very limited amount of influence that the Bar Standards Board has on that. What influence we have, we certainly try to use.
Well, Mark, could I just add something? I mean, in all honesty, Stephen, I think this is an area of political, where political decisions are made, and it's particularly for the representative bodies, the Law Society, and here the Bar Council, to, as we do, to seek to lobby government and opposition in relation to the proper resourcing of our justice system, and that's one of the big things that we do day by day. And it may be that this is an area, in fact, where collaboration could work quite well. But ultimately, the regulators cannot, I think you probably agree with this, Mark, stray too far into the campaigning or political arena. I do. That's pretty squarely for us as the representative body to really champion. And actually, there's one thing I would disagree with. I think, as you say, Stephen, the Bar is very much interested in access to justice, in the provision of early legal advice, to avoid people going down that terrible cycle of alienation and despair. If there's CABs, third sector organisations there that can help at the earliest stage, the Bar Council is advocating for that day after day, and that we want to see that, even though it doesn't benefit, if you like, the professional private interests of barristers. Access to justice is squarely something that we support. But anyway, I think just going back to this is a regulation tool. I think it is an area where, so far as we can, we might be able to add some
I very much agree.
activity there.
I was going to ask, would you agree that the BSB focuses on regulating individual barristers rather than chambers? And is this the right approach? Does it spend enough time regulating chambers? I mean, you visit chambers, you mentioned it in your excellent presentation.
Well, it's a very interesting question. We don't regulate chambers directly.
No,
we regulate individual barristers.
Yeah, and my question is really that ultimately the right approach?
Well, we do regulate barristers' practice management. So we make we put certain obligations on barristers in relation to how they come together in chambers, and that comes quite close to regulating chambers, if not.
But there is a distinction.
There is a distinction. There is definitely a distinction. But as the initiative I described, aims to do, I think chambers can be hugely important allies for regulation.
I'm sure they are.
Because chambers are much closer to the front line than we can ever be. There are 100 of us, and there are 17,500 barristers, and our powers are very nuclear. They're not powers that can sensibly, course correct for a barrister who's had an off day in court, or can deal with recruitment problems in a particular chambers, or can readily put things right where a chamber's account of its fees is not very easily understood by consumers. So we need chambers to step up to the plate. I think this is somewhere where we and the Bar Council can absolutely collaborate. We setting down the requirements we place on barristers as to practice management, and the Bar Council marshalling the guidance and good practice that is undoubtedly out there, so that all chambers can be brought up to the levels of the best. So I hope that provides you with a
thank you.
with that. Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm one of the lay non-executive directors on the Bar Standards Board, for those of you who don't know me. I'd just like to come back to that conversation we had, where we were touching on some fairly important political issues, particularly around the whole issue of access to justice. And I agree that I think that is principally and fundamentally a role of the representatives of the various professions to lead on all of that. But I think I could speak on behalf of my BSB colleagues that if there were the right opportunities for joining forces and collaborating in some way, if only in the provision of data and information that would be useful in terms of your advocacy for better funding for the criminal justice system, for instance. I think there would be some willingness on our part to take part in all of that. So I just thought that was worth mentioning. But very much with you in the lead. It is your core business, as it were. But I think we could work together on that.
I would just add a commentary on that, or build on that just a little bit. It would be very easy for members of the bar to sit here like Formula One drivers and say, fix the track. But in reality, it affects everybody. These are the courts in which we operate. These are the courts in which our clients operate. These are the courts in which litigants in person wander into, not knowing where they're going or which way is up. And we do not appear to have, and have not had in many years, this is not a political statement, both sides of the aisle are equally guilty. We have not had government support in many years that has truly understood legal services to be a critical service. They barely understand that the NHS is a critical service. They certainly don't understand that legal services is one. But it is when you find yourself in it. And when we talk about, funding given to the courts during, lockdown and everything else, it was cleaning supplies. The hot water still doesn't work if it even exists. Some of the cell doors can't be opened on cold days. They're delivering prisoners to the wrong courts, left, right, and centre. That's just on the criminal side. And at the risk of being the sort of stick-out sore thumb here, there's a desperate need for strong advocacy with this government, or whichever government's going to be in next, to get funding for both the criminal and civil justice system. It's broken.
I think Sam was volunteering to take on the...
Because, I'm happy to join any discussion or any initiative. It's desperately needed. And I'm not just talking to for myself. I get about my business, but these are real people, most of whom may go to court once in their life.
Yeah.
God forbid if they get into trouble with the police and it's a criminal matter, it's even worse for them. But they're getting lost in something, and we're still running around with paper bundles.
I think we should probably adjourn, but thank you all very much for